Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. It is great to be back with all of you. I hope everyone's doing well, staying warm out there. Darren, we're in the midst of a frosty season, although it wasn't necessarily this way a few weeks ago. I felt like it was kind of a mild winter, but now it's really kicked into low gear and low temps. I'm breaking out the heavy jackets and getting ready for the really chilly weekend ahead. We've got a forecast that's still a bit mixed in terms of ice and snow for the Asheville, Western North Carolina region. It looks like it's going to be a pretty crazy storm, though, hitting a lot of folks across the eastern United States. And anytime you talk about ice, things can get pretty dicey. And so hopefully everybody stays safe out there. Ice is not to be trifled with. If it's icy, do not drive out at all. It is not something that you can conquer. I don't care what kind of vehicle you have. It's very, very challenging to drive in. So hope everybody stays safe. But other than that, it's been, this month is going by quickly. Januaries have that new energy to them, but I always am surprised at how quickly they just tend to fly right by. And we're well on our way into the new year here, into 2026. So, Darren, what's been going on with you?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I've been partly thinking about how so many people are talking about 2026 is going to be a big year. Of course, it seems like, as you and I have often reflected on, people are always saying that. And like you say, that new energy does tend to be underwritten with a sense that we're at the apex of something massive is about to change. Now, on the one hand, I can totally understand that people would look at the state of the world, the chaotic nature of the world right now, and think that something's got to change because it's just so insane in many ways and incoherent. And in the midst of that, we do have this ongoing conversation publicly around the UFO phenomenon, which, also was reflected yesterday in this press conference that was held at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., where James Fox brought together witnesses to talk about this 30-year-old case in Varginha, Brazil, that UFO incident. So that was interesting, just seeing something that was almost reminiscent of when Stephen Greer would bring people together to actually host these kind of conferences and try to bring together lawmakers and the public and people from the press, as well as the people who were the witnesses. So it was interesting to watch that and to think about, is this really going to move the ball forward? So I'm just curious to ask you, when you heard about that event, I know you sort of heard some reactions to the event. What's your sense about its importance in terms of a historical context?
Well, you have to hand it to James Fox for putting this in motion, making it happen. He's been really pursuing this case and not giving up, and I really appreciate that. He deserves a lot of credit for that tenacity. I do think it's important. I think it goes into the body of evidence that is, quote unquote, official and public facing. I think it says a lot that you've got the caliber of witnesses that are willing to speak about their experiences. I love that we've got the international case component to this as well. And some of the reactions that we've heard is that the U.S. audience has been a lot more receptive to the testimony of these witnesses than their Brazilian counterparts. The Brazilian culture really seems to have struggled with accepting elements of the story. But in the U.S., it seems to be gaining a lot more traction. And that was encouraging to hear. They felt welcome by James and by the attendees. I know not all of the witnesses were able to attend in person for various international travel reasons. It's tough to travel into the U.S. from Brazil right now because of visa restrictions. But I think it made a big impact. I think it will make an impact in the future as people continue to sort of search for that material. I mean, I'm hopeful that James is going to crack this case at some point. He seems like he's continuing to make progress, momentum on getting more and more evidence out there and in the hands of the public. And so, I'm hopeful that will be the case. And I know that, lawmakers were able to kind of lend their support for this. At the same time, and I have to be honest, it's like what we've talked about for the last many months. We are in a bit of a stalemate with the progress of the disclosure movement. I think that you're naive to think otherwise. we're in a challenging spot. That I think it's almost like the classic lines on the battlefield where you've got the trenches and everybody's just dug in, and you try to leave the trench and you try to make an offensive move and see if you can break through, and you can't, and then you retreat back to the trench and just regroup and hope for the best in the next opportunity. That really is what it feels like right now. And with everything else going on, things that you alluded to in the world, it's a chaotic environment. So even if you get what you want and you get that disclosure that you're hoping for from events like this, is the atmosphere conducive to even breaking that information? I mean, it's just such a crazy world right now. So I don't know. I'm again grateful and I'm thankful for James and what he did, and for the witnesses and their bravery and stepping forward and sharing their testimony. That they should be applauded for that. But I don't think it's making a meaningful impact at this moment. I think it does have an impact in the grand scope, the grand scheme of the overall story.
Right, I agree about that. And it's interesting because you pointed out the fact that this is an international case, which I agree is important. But it's also important because it points to the fact that there is quite a breadth of different kinds of experiences. And this was not your typical gray or Nordic or reptilian in that sense. This was a being described as being kind of brown colored with red eyes, kind of oily, gave off a sulfuric kind of smell. And also what's interesting is that there are some asymmetric elements to the story in the sense that it doesn't fit an either love and light or demons and darkness kind of framing, because on the one hand, this being is depicted as being actually quite communicative about the fact that humankind has lost their connection with the deeper whole. And actually, some of the witnesses actually testified to saying that the being looked a bit scared when they first saw it. So it was as afraid as they were when they saw it. But on top of that, while it was a benevolent being apparently, and it communicated, for instance, to the doctors that were trying to operate on him, or it, but on top of that, there were people who died as a result of coming into some sort of contact with some sort of viral infection or something, which is sort of more of a science-based understanding. So there are numerous elements to the story that I think are quite fascinating, because some people, as I have said before, want to frame this as happening kind of only in consciousness, which we'll unpack a little bit later. That's a problematic statement in itself. But happening in some sort of third imaginal realm, well, if that's the case, people don't tend to die of viral infections when it's happening there. At the same time, this being that was physical, that there clearly was lots of evidence there was a cover-up, that even the U.S. military swooped in and took possession at some point. One of the witnesses talks about being visited by men in black, basically, afterwards, and being offered money to be not just silent, but to actually go public and say that it didn't happen, that the girls mistook what they saw. So many fascinating elements. And what I was also struck by was how, just like what happened with Stephen Greer back when he gave his initial disclosure testimony with his witnesses he brought forward, was there's going to be another whole host of people coming online now for the first time. So you and I have been in this for a while. There's some people who've been in it a lot longer than us. One of the people that was seen on video at the conference yesterday was Jacques Vallée, who's been doing this for so long. Jacques actually made some surprising comments, I think, that some people were surprised by what he said. Seemed to go against some things he's said before in terms of how he frames all of this. But nevertheless, I was reflecting today on the fact that you'll have this whole new host of people, whole new generations of people that will be introduced to this topic because of what James Fox has pulled together here and this cast of witnesses. Because whether or not this actually moves public disclosure, it will undoubtedly encourage a lot of new people to say there must be something to this. And this will be their entryway into what you and I know is a reality-altering kind of endeavor. And to that point, today I was thinking we could actually walk through some of the implications and some of the progression that people go through inevitably when they encounter this information. And when I say this information, I mean the UFO lore, all the elements that are well attested, but at the same time are often resisted because they're just so strange. So in the midst of this and unpacking each of these, I would like you and I to reflect on how we've changed, how we've been forced to consider not just what this might be, but the assumptions we bring to bear that might be limiting what we might conceive this of being. So as I begin with that, just give me some of your reflection on what this has been like for you the last decade and being on this journey.
Yeah, I think about the the phrase, the initiation, right? It is an initiatory experience, and you hear a lot of folks discuss it in that way, whether you're exposed to the material and you're giving it some purchase, and then you're giving it more and more of your attention, and you're beginning to turn your models around and over to accommodate the information. It becomes that initiatory process. Or whether you've had a direct experience that you're confronted like a lightning bolt, you're struck out of nowhere, and you have no choice but to wrestle with this new reality. You're thrust into a new world. And I think that's something that is, it's a very powerful experience for a human being to go through. And sometimes I think we forget in our adult lives what that feels like, because when you're a child, you absolutely go through an initiatory experience when you're young, right? You're thrust into a world that you had no choosing, at least it seems on the face of it, no choosing to join. There's all these lights and colors and sounds and smells, and things are sharp and things are soft, and you're trying to navigate that experience. And so it can be very challenging for you to begin building a model of reality from just a novel experience. And as you grow, that change, sort of growth moment that you go through, it's something that you can forget. You can forget that what it was like to do that, to struggle with those experiences. My sister has 2 kids. They're both under the age of 3, and when you're with little kids like that, you experience it. You experience their frustration as they're navigating the world and trying to make sense of, why do we do things this way, and why can't I do it this way? And oh, I got hurt when I tried to do this. And it can be very frustrating. And so similarly, I think if you look at adulthood initiatory experiences, whether you are pursuing the phenomena or you're discovering a new hobby, you go through the same kinds of phases, but you have a little bit of wisdom, right? You have a little bit of wisdom that you're bringing into that with you. And so you can decide, you can say, look, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to be really frustrated with this new knowledge, and I'm going to maybe end up rejecting it and just turn my back on it and go back to my old ways. Or you're going to say, I'm going to have to incorporate this information into my worldview, into my reality model. And so for me personally, it has been a struggle at times to sit with this information, to really make sense of it, to try to take the awkward pieces and fit them in, and try to find a home for those. And then to really honestly ask myself, is the model that I am creating with this content, is it a model that is explanatory? Is it helpful? Is it healthy? Is it something that I would want others to consider? And if I say yes to that, why? Why is it more meaningful to take these things into consideration than not? And so I personally think that they're incredibly valuable. I think that if you make space for the phenomena, that you are making room at your ontological table for a lot more experience in the world and a broader reality. And that has just inherent meaning, inherent beauty to bring that into the equation. So for me, it's been challenging, but incredibly rewarding. And I'd love to talk more about, what the more challenging aspects are and things that I still struggle with. And, I, as you know, and as our listeners know, I kind of operate on the boundary of this conversation, and I'm an outsider looking in many ways, but I'm very much willing to believe and to acknowledge that this is real. And so it's an interesting place to be, and I think a lot of people are in that place. They're phenomenologically curious, and they want to know how does this work, right? So hopefully my goal, and I think one of our shared goals, is to find a way to give folks an on-ramp into this journey, and not necessarily prescribe the exact solution, but give them some frameworks by which they can try to navigate this new territory. So hopefully we're having some success with that, but it is incredibly challenging.
It is. And I think too about what you're reflecting on there. And I think about how, when you shared about childhood and what that's like and the initiatory experience they go through. But something we also lose once we leave childhood is this kind of enchanted view of reality often, and just the newness of every day. I once heard this person talking about how a child will see a door and will say, a door. It's this amazing, fantastical kind of element where who knows what's on the other side of it. Whereas we've kind of become kind of lame about the whole thing, like, oh, it's a door. It just goes from one room to another. But then you think about the UFO phenomenon and Skinwalker Ranch and portals in the sky. That's a whole different kind of door. That's a whole different kind of fantastical door that brings that all back in. And you'll remember from the retreat at Mount Shasta in June of last year, we talked about that. We went around the circle in the big yurt and talked about how we've had a reenchantment kind of experience with reality because of, for many people, what they've come across with the UFO phenomenon data, which is fascinating in itself. And that actually makes more sense to me now than it used to, and that's something we'll unpack. But I agree with you. As we go through here, we should take the opportunity to be honest about what's been enchanting and enlightening, but what also has been bewildering and perplexing and discombobulating and troubling, disconcerting. All those elements are in here. And when I think about sort of where I am poised right now, I won't say where I'm landed, but where I'm poised right now, I would say that I'm aware that it's both something that's incredibly liberating and enlightening, but also incredibly discombobulating. And I can understand what Jim Semivan is referring to when he's saying that this is indigestible. I think the way I think about it being indigestible is a bit different than the way he thinks about it, but it certainly is unmooring for 99.9% of the public. And that's something we'll get to here. And you spoke about different elements. Some are more easily digestible than others for yourself. And so we'll actually name some of those elements that sort of just stand out there in the lore, in the data that we have to make sense of. And I know that what both you and I have tried to do over time is consider as much of that data as possible and see what fits, what kind of model could exist that would make sense of all that data. But that said, for the people who attended that conference for the first time yesterday or who saw it on TV or something or on YouTube, obviously there's a lot more eyes that can see it now in the YouTube generation than when Stephen Greer first held his conference. They're going to inevitably jump in with the ET hypothesis. So let's talk about this and not just what it is, but what reality model assumptions come along with this model, because this is something we want to unpack today. It's not just the different hypotheses, but what assumptions about reality do they bring? What kind of baggage do you bring along? And this is something that I think is so, so important. And I really would want to underline this for people today, for our audience, because I have found that inevitably there will be assumptions that you're not even aware you're making because you've just inherited them as part of our culture. But inevitably you get to them if you're honest in your assessment and if you will honestly try to make sense of this data. The data eventually makes you go, well, what if it's not this that's the problem? What if it's something prior to this? This is when we begin to question the assumptions. And once I did that, I actually found a model. I'm entertaining a model. This will come up in the book I'm writing that I think does a pretty good job of making sense of all the data. But let's start with ETH. So let me describe the basics here, Nathan, and then you can talk about how you first entertained this notion and where it fits for you now. So the premise here is that UFOs, of course, are vehicles piloted by intelligent beings from other planets or star systems. Now, the reality model assumptions that come along include physicalism/materialism, that reality exists independently of human consciousness. We also believe, according to this model, that interstellar travel is constrained by known physical laws, though current unknown advanced technologies may exist. So inevitably, if you have a physicalist perspective and you see these beings as being aliens, then you have the question of how could they get here at such a vast distance? And skeptics will bring that up as something that kind of undoes this. Finally, we assume that the consciousness of the beings is tied to biological or quasi-biological substrates because we assume that's true of all physical reality. Now, what supports this? Well, we have apparently advanced craft making maneuvers beyond human capability, and we have reported encounters with humanoid or gray entities. What about limitations? Well, there is no publicly verifiable physical evidence of non-human craft or occupants. We hear about rumors from Dave Gresham people about them sitting in hangars somewhere in bodies and gurneys, but they haven't been publicly shown yet. And we have notion of travel at reported speeds that conflict with current physics. So that's what's on the table when you think about the ETH. So tell me about your relationship, your ongoing relationship with this model.
Well, I mean, like a lot of folks, I think I grew up with the ET hypothesis being just part of my upbringing, right? You've got Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you've got ET, the Extraterrestrial, a host of other movies that and TV shows that I grew up watching. And so considering life on other planets and intelligent life and that they might interact with humanity, that was something that really felt like it was just part of the entertainment and the culture of the United States, that it was a very feasible kind of thing. And in terms of thinking about it more deeply, though, my reflections go to how we conceive of the encountering an other in the world. And so coming from, the older that I get, the more I realize how short lifespans really are. And so when you think about where the world was just a few hundred years ago and how we were interacting with different cultures in the world, when you have explorers who are arriving on ships on shores where those ships had never ever landed before, and the indigenous people of those countries, of those nations, viewing these ships and not even knowing what category to slot them into necessarily. So you have that encounter with the other that is, I think, still fresh in the mind of our culture. And so you can kind of map that experience onto a larger experience where the new shore is space, the new ocean is space, and the new shores are these other planets, and we're going to arrive on those shores, and we'll meet other creatures that are that live in those places. So you can kind of see how that's a very attractive way of thinking about encountering other intelligent life. And what I find frustrating about the hypothesis, I think many people find this as well, you start learning about things like the SETI initiative. You start learning that, we have sent plenty of things into space and we've not found anything. We've not encountered anything. So, why is that? It's so perplexing. Okay, well, the universe is so large. And you then get to a place where I think you're having to do, as you suggested, you're having to fill a lot of gaps with just kind of fancy technology, like, right? The fancy technology becomes the magic that allows for these inexplainable situations. And so if we just had the fancy technology, the distance between planets wouldn't matter, and this, that, and the other. And that's an attractive answer, because, if you've lived in the 20th and 21st centuries, you know that technology is incredibly powerful, and new technologies, as they come online, they present us with new capabilities. But that said, I think it's still an unsatisfactory way of thinking about what these things are, and particularly as you take in the breadth of the experiences, because they don't behave just like another being would behave if you encountered them in the forest, right? That there are these other qualities to those encounters that don't slot neatly into just running into a bear, or running into another person you just never met. That there are aspects to those encounters that are incredibly frustrating and perplexing and just downright weird. So I think that's where the ETH again also starts to break down, and its ability to explain what those encounters are doing, what it really means. So I still think it's a cool hypothesis, and I think that there's room in our universe absolutely for that possibility, and even present on the planet as ETs on the planet. I think that's still a possibility, but is it the model that I think I would hang my hat on? No, I don't think it has enough explanatory power to be useful for all of the kinds of encounters that we've heard about.
Right, and as we proceed here, we should give our usual disclaimer to say that these are not mutually exclusive. There can be numerous things going on here. I would argue there's a kind of stratification of the UFO phenomenon, and I think both skeptics and debunkers, as well as quote-unquote believers, make the mistake of trying to assess it as one thing. I think there's numerous things going on. And I agree with you that there's no reason why the ETH can't be part of the picture. I think it likely is. When you said in our universe, that begs the question, what exactly is our universe? That's something I'll unpack a little bit later and we can entertain. But a few things I reflect on when I think about the ETH, absolutely, I felt all this nostalgia come back when you talked about seeing ET and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and just how much awe and wonder there was in the 80s as we were kids watching these movies that came out, they were just so wondrous and filled us with so much fascination. It's also interesting because we have people, of course, the giants like both John Keel and Jacques Vallée, who began with assumptions around the ETH. They were some of the early pioneers, along with J. Allen Hynek, who actually said, hold up, in light of all the evidence and the nature of the evidence, and as you said, the high strangeness that's associated with the evidence, surely the ETH alone can't be sufficient to explain this. So we'll unpack some of that. So in addition to describing each of the models, we'll also go through the data points themselves, some of the really strange aspects, and how this led to ever more strange theories in some ways to try to make sense of it. I think, too, that with the ETH, we have to understand that, as you said, is this notion of the frontier. We think about our country and pushing across west to reclaim these parts of the frontier, that there was this notion, this was even part of the opening in Star Trek, Space, the Final Frontier. And there was that notion, so we assumed that it would be a similar kind of process. But of course, that's because when we were spreading across our country and claiming the Oregon Territory, we assumed that was a real world and real land. We assumed that when we're going into space and exploring these different planets, that these are real things across these distances. I remember seeing Tom Campbell, who's talked about this being a virtual reality, basically. He was on Joe Rogan. Then when it came to the idea of traveling to Mars or something, Joe Rogan said, well, we know it's a distance because it takes so long to get there. So you could see he was folding back into this notion, because of my experience directly, space must be real, right, in some way. And on another show, I saw someone asking Tom Campbell, okay, so are there other physical realities? And one of the things that we can get into later is that when people talk about the simulation hypothesis, that's still based in physicalism, really, which is, again, what undergirds the ET hypothesis. But what Tom Campbell said to this guy was, there is no such thing as a physical reality at all. And this is sort of where you end up going with this data. But we'll have to get there in steps, because the next one we want to get to, which again comes up when we think about people like John Keel and Jacques Vallée, they were some of the first ones to propose this. But as you and I both know, what's fascinating about this dance that happens over time is that the models, the theories, the hypotheses that are being proposed are always lockstep with our latest physics, our latest understanding of cutting-edge physics. So in the 60s, there was this notion that was being proposed about a multiverse and different parallel physical realities. So when someone like Jacques Vallée looked at the fact that these craft seemed to be able to pop into existence and then apparently dematerialize or pop out, he thought, well, maybe they're just going to a place that's invisible to us, but it's a parallel reality. So that's what we have next, is the interdimensional or multiverse hypothesis. The premise here is that UFOs originate from other dimensions, and by that we usually mean physical dimensions, let's be clear, universes or realities that intersect with ours or are existing in parallel with ours. What are the reality model assumptions to do with this hypothesis? Well, the notion is that reality is layered or multi-level with multiple overlapping space-time manifold. Again, physical realities, different physical universes within a multiverse. The notion here is that physical laws in one dimension may differ or be flexible in another. And there's an assumption of a physicalist framing of reality, though. I think we really need to underline that. This is something I pointed out on social media today, that when we have Luna saying things like, in classified meetings, I'm learning that people are believing or having evidence for the notion that these are interdimensionals. That really is just a placeholder. We've talked about this. This is a buzzword that's going around. It basically stands in for, it's weirder than ETH, but we don't know really what it is. But just to be clear, the notion of interdimensionals, as it's framed in that kind of thinking, still believes in a physical reality, just kind of increases the scope so there are multiple physical realities existing within a multiverse. So what about support or observations to do with this particular hypothesis? Well, like I said, you have the sudden appearance or disappearance of objects. You have the idea of objects passing through walls. You have reports of phasing or objects that defy conventional physics. And there is no empirical evidence, and this is posited to explain fine-tuning. So what I want to point out here is that we sometimes forget that the reason this historically was proposed was partly to explain why our universe seems so particularly fine-tuned, so well-equipped to host life. When they started analyzing all the different elements, and if they were just a little bit different, microscopically different, life would have never formed to begin with. Even planets wouldn't have coalesced into planets. So the fine-tuning was so precise that it looked a little bit like a designer behind the whole thing. Of course, at this point, science was divorced from religion back from Europe a few centuries ago. So that wasn't going to stand for these scientists. So they proposed a pretty exotic theory that, as Bernardo Kastrup has pointed out, there is zero empirical evidence for. This is all basically speculation. We should make that clear. The notion that there are other physical realities, we have zero evidence to support that. There is some empirical evidence that might mean that, but it could be interpreted very differently. We have no conclusive evidence suggesting there is any other physical reality. Again, we still have questions about whether this is physical. We'll get to that. So, what are the limitations of this hypothesis? Well, as I said, it's highly speculative, and empirical testing is extremely difficult. Some scientists have said there's no way you could ever test this, actually. And it does not explain the cultural convergence in reported craft or entities, including going back into religious history and all that. So, all that said, Nathan, what's your relationship with interdimensionals? Have you met some? Tell us about this. And how has that evolved over time?
Yeah, sometimes I wonder if I have met some interdimensionals. It's an attractive hypothesis, I think, in the sense that it feels a little bit higher brow than just the ET hypothesis. So you can see why there's a lure to it on that basis alone, that if you feel that the ET hypothesis is a little tired, the multiverse, the interdimensional, the parallel, reality, that can feel more attractive because it's sort of ripe with more possibility in a way, and it makes space for, I think, some of the stranger aspects of the phenomena that maybe the ET hypothesis has struggles with. And so I can see why that can be a pretty attractive model to entertain. It also has, I think, some parallels to some ancient ways of thinking about reality. And here I'm thinking about, you can look at the ancient traditions where you're talking about the gods and goddesses and how they intersect and interact with the human plane. And there's this underlying assumption that there's a realm in which these powers reside, and that realm is very similar to our realm, but they don't really intersect. They're kind of in parallel, and they can dip into our realm, and we can sometimes, dip into theirs. But the general, there are rules, and there is kind of a physicality to both of those dimensions. So it has its roots in some of these older concepts, I think, of thinking about the human experience. And then it also brings in some of our broadening awareness about the lack of our own knowledge, right? So we're beginning to see, with this theory, we're beginning to see glimpses of and acknowledgments that what we can observe and what we can sense about our world has limitations. And so there are certainly aspects to reality which exist beyond our capacity to directly experience them. So it's beginning to acknowledge that, okay, yes, there is a reality out there that we may not be able to directly interface with. And so let's just call that, an interdimension, another dimension, another multiverse kind of situation. And so it's making some space, I think, for that unknown, which is good. It's healthy. It's acknowledging that we do have some limitations. We may not have all the answers, but it has its similar failure in the sense it's kind of a God of the gap solution as well. It's like, well, I don't really know what it is, and we can't really study it per se, but it's, it just must be another dimension, another universe like ours, just we can't see it. And the situations by which there is some bleed over, well, maybe that happens through some sort of technology, again, using technology as a way to bridge the gap and explain those encounters. So it's interesting. I understand why we've come to the place where that can be an attractive hypothesis, but for me, it still falls short of being something that truly explains the breadth of the experiences.
It's interesting because it's kind of a bridge hypothesis in a way, right? Because as you say, it sort of stands in to say this is something we don't understand. It's different, but it's somehow connected to us, might be running in parallel. But it also is conventional enough that people can get by saying it, and it sounds quasi-scientific. But again, I just want to point out to people that there is no empirical evidence suggesting these other physical realities exist. And as you pointed to, it doesn't really at all address why there would be so much high strangeness and the tie-in with ancient history and all that. I also want to address something you brought up before when you talked about this almost like a faith we have that sufficiently advanced technology could accomplish all of this. And I was thinking about when you mentioned God of the gaps, there's also maybe a notion of technology of the gaps, right? We just fill in and say, if we can explain something, we'll just say, well, eventually we'll have technology that can do that. But the fact that this ends up intersecting with the occult and esoteric history and religious history and psi and different capacities that human beings seem to have is converging around a notion that's much more interesting while also more strange. But before we get to some of those, I want to introduce another one that kind of does talk about the psychology aspect, but it talks about it more from the frame of a psychosocial kind of projection. So this is a hypothesis that proposes this is all psychosocial and a cultural projection. So the premise here is that UFOs are projections of human psychology influenced by culture, myths, and mass media, like the fact that you and I, and so many people in our generation, saw E.T. and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The reality model assumptions here are that consciousness constructs perceptual reality in significant ways. Notice there it says perceptual reality. I want to be precise here. We're not here talking about consciousness actually creating reality. We're just talking about our perception of it. And the notion here is that objective reality does exist, but it's filtered through cognitive, emotional, and cultural frameworks. And that symbols and archetypes can manifest in perception. Again, there's still a distinction between perception and the quote-unquote real world without external physical objects. So, support and observations to do with this hypothesis. Well, UFO imagery often reflects contemporary societal fears or myths. And there's a correlation with sleep phenomena, hallucinations, or collective imagination. Limitations. It cannot fully explain multi-sensor or radar-confirmed events. So if this is all just about perception and human psychology overlaid over a separate objective reality, then why do we have sensors recording these things and radar recording these things? We also have physical traces or interactions with matter that remain unexplained. So traces that seem to show up in physical, quote-unquote, reality. There's also a Carl Jung kind of variant to this. He emphasizes archetypes and the collective unconscious. He suggests that UFOs are a modern myth that expresses itself because of societal stress that is arising. So it's a response to social stress, basically. And it adds a psychological symbolic lens, sometimes extending into psychic reality, hinting at interaction with consciousness itself. So this is interesting. It's not, again, getting to the point of maybe where we're going to go a little bit later, but it does begin to introduce the notion that we have to at least make sense of human perception, human psychology, and how that at least overwrites over top a supposedly objective reality. And some people will go so far as to say that because we all grew up on these Hollywood movies, Nathan, and we saw Star Trek and Star Wars growing up, that this has inevitably influenced what we think we're experiencing, and all of it can be ascribed to that. So what's your take with that particular hypothesis?
Well, for one, I do think that human beings, we are very susceptible to, we have biases, very strong biases, and you can demonstrate that by studying illusions, for example. You can look at a variety of different illusions. There's a lot of classic ones you can find on the internet, and you can see how easily our perceptions can be duped into thinking we understand what reality is, when in fact we have that wrong entirely. So I think it's a mistake to discount that aspect of the lived experience entirely. But what I dislike about this particular theory is that it kind of sterilizes the experiences with sort of in sweeping motions. It sort of takes all of the these reported encounters, and it reduces them down to tricks of the brain, basically. And there's an implicit, in a way, an implicit air of authority to it that, well, I understand what's happening. I know you think you saw such and such, but what really is going on is that's the influence of your culture and your upbringing and your bias, and you therefore concocted through your imagination a placeholder for some other experience that what was really happening to you, that you substituted in for that. And I find that to be, inadequate. I think it also kind of is a little bit patronizing to the individuals who have those experiences, and therefore I feel like it lacks some authenticity in acknowledging that weird things happen to everyone, and just because you might have that perception, that awareness that human beings are susceptible to these kinds of influences, it somehow puts you above everybody else, and you're not susceptible to those things. So everyone is similarly susceptible, but these things do happen. And Jeffrey Kripal comes to mind in terms of someone who's trying to speak to that aspect of it, that, as much as we think these impossible things don't happen, well, we have report after report after report of them in fact happening. So we have to wrestle with that reality, regardless of what sort of modern conceptions we want to slap onto that, and make ourselves feel a little more comfortable that, oh, that's not real. It's tricks of the mind. And so I find that to be a little dangerous, kind of thinking to endorse that one wholeheartedly. But I do think it has elements within it that are helpful and explanatory, because it is true that, and you can look at, you've read so many experiencer accounts. I'm sure many of our listeners have as well. As you're reading those accounts, and the more you know about the person who's had the experience, the more you begin to see how their lived experience has influenced how they interpret what happened. And we've got plenty of modern examples of that as well. That people have a strong interpretation of their experience, and that's just one interpretation, but it's influenced by their life experience. So I think that is a valuable insight, but I think it's a mistake to say, this is entirely psychological and that there's no underlying reality to it. I think that's a failure of this hypothesis.
Agreed. And it's interesting because at the Archives of the Impossible conference in 2023, there was an academic who gave a presentation that basically was talking about all of the social influence when it came to this phenomenon, and basically talked about all the ways that the cultural framing evolved over time because of the involvement of Hollywood and that kind of thing, and the intersection between Hollywood, the general public, and the media. And interestingly, when someone asked him, I noticed in your presentation, you actually haven't addressed or weighed in whether or not there actually is a phenomenon behind the whole thing. And he said, sorry, above my pay grade, I'm not going to go there. He actually refused to answer, which was fascinating. I think partly it's just job protection as an academic. He felt like he could be on thin ice if he were to weigh in. But I'm frustrated by that, actually. And while I was at that dinner, I also saw happen what you described. I saw an experiencer I know share an experience she had during an abduction, and I saw another academic tell her to her face, I think you misinterpreted what happened to you, in a way that wasn't at all empathetic at all. And I was kind of shocked, and I challenged him on it in the moment, because I thought, who are you to say that you know better than she does her own experience? Now, this does get interesting, though, because we are beginning to move into the psychology intersection with the phenomenon, and that will lead to a further unpacking of what we think reality is, I think, as we move on here. So we're beginning to see that this does play a role, and we go, though, from assuming that there is an objective physical reality out there, and then there's the human experience that overlays interpretations. That's certainly part of it. But we go even further later on. We begin to ask, is that dividing line something you can even delineate, or is the entire process interactive one, and that we actually live inside of a participatory kind of cosmos? And when I say cosmos, I don't necessarily mean a physical cosmos. We'll unpack that as we go on there. So each of these hypotheses so far are interesting. They probably answer some of what's going on, but notice that all three of them still lean on a physicalist framing of reality, basically. We're now going to go into the next one, which we've heard more recently in the UFO phenomenon community that we're a part of. You might remember, Nathan, when the term ultra-terrestrial, which has been around for a while, but it seemed to really spring to the forefront a few years ago in our community, and people were really wondering if this is a good explanation. They're often grouped together with crypto-terrestrials, so we'll sort of put this together as the ultra-terrestrial/crypto-terrestrial hypothesis. The premise here is that a non-human intelligence native to Earth, but hidden from humanity, meaning they're either subterranean, oceanic, or otherwise concealed. And the core assumptions here are that they have cohabited with humanity for a long period of time, that there is cultural and mythological continuity here. This accounts for ancient sightings and folklore overlap. So again, the notion is that we don't actually have magical creatures coming from a place like Magonia, but we might have these beings that live right alongside of us, but somehow either have technology, again, there's that technology of the gaps, or maybe psychic powers that can influence human perception that allows them to stay hidden, or maybe they just have really great camouflage over their bases in the ocean or deep in the caverns of the earth and that kind of thing. There also is another kind of ultra-terrestrial that has been described that is kind of a blend or a morphing together of different elements that is kind of interdimensional as well as present on the earth. And some people would say that a creature like Bigfoot or Sasquatch is a creature that is hard to pin down, even though he's well attested over time. And the reason is because it's an interdimensional creature or ultra-terrestrial creature. And by that we mean they can manifest on the planet and walk around and be seen and leave traces and things like that, broken branches behind, but they don't primarily dwell here. So we have some people that refer to ultra-terrestrials as being just hidden, but on the planet with us. Other people who say they're sometimes here, sometimes not. So think back to when that came into your awareness and how that fits in at this point.
Well, I loved being exposed to this one because I think it, and you can see there's a little bit of a trend line from where we started, that the sphere of what is permissible in the hypothesis becomes broader. And so I like this one because it does that as well. It's beginning to challenge the long-held assumption that human beings are somehow the pinnacle species, the intelligent species of the planet. It's beginning to look at the true span of geological time and say, wait a minute, like maybe a lot has happened on the planet that we are unaware of, and could have happened, and civilizations could have arisen and fallen long before we ever got here, and it's making space for that as a possibility. So I like it for that reason. I think it expands the playing field for what is possible, and certainly makes more room for the mysterious aspects of our planet, of our home. And you pointed out that there are the links, of course, into the folklore, into the mythology, and the interactions with humanity throughout our written and oral tradition and history. I think that this does a nice job of trying to make sense of that without doing what some of the other models do, and they sort of look down on those older stories and say, oh, look at this fancy mythology that our ancestors came up with. It's just a bunch of gobbledygook that helped them make sense of a world they didn't understand. And clearly there aren't fairies, and there isn't a Bigfoot, and there isn't, insert whatever you think is impossible to exist. And so I think this begins to make more space for things that historically we would have, or at least in the modern time, we would have discarded. So I do like it for that reason. I think it still falls short in terms of the experiences, and it's, you have to basically, you end up making room for what you alluded to, and that is you make room for this possibility that they're here, but they operate in some sort of hidden realm. They're like a cloaked realm that we can't seem to directly observe, or you say, oh, well, they must live at the bottom of the ocean because that's not our habitat, or they live in, underneath the earth in some sort of subterranean domain, or they live literally, they occupy the same space that we occupy. It's just that they phase through us because of some sort of state that they exist in that doesn't interact with what we would call physical matter. So you start making these exceptions for how this might mechanically work, and I'm not sure that those explanations are all that helpful. Or they at least I don't think they seem to explain what the true breadth of what we hear about. So I like it. I think it is interesting. I do think it expands the sort of the intellectual landscape here about what could be on the table, but I think it does ultimately fall short.
Yeah, interesting, because I've noticed over time, I'm sure you've noticed the same thing, that sometimes a scientist with credentials will coin a new term and people will latch onto it as assuming it kind of has some reality now, some substance, just because it was given a term. And the term that I remember being introduced a few years ago that spoke to what you talked about was shadow biome. Do you remember when that was introduced? Suddenly, as soon as people heard that, they latched onto it like, aha, there's a shadow biome. That's what it is. When really that's just a couple words put together to describe one possibility, right? It's a plausible explanation, but again, there's not necessarily empirical evidence. But when you hear a scientist say it, then it sounds interesting. When you have a politician saying she's heard in classified settings that these are interdimensionals, the same thing happens. But basically, it's the emperor wearing no clothes in many ways. All right, so those are models that have been introduced to try to make sense of the data. So I think at this point it would be helpful in the final half an hour and a bit of the show to get into what are some of those data points that are confounding, that stretch each of these models, so that if the models do apply, they only apply in part, that they don't capture the full data. So I'm going to list these three at a time, and then we can sort of riff on them and what we think about them. And again, this is where we could sort of chime in and say, this is really challenging for me, or this has been challenging, but I made peace with it, or maybe it still is something that is hard to wrestle with. So the first three are as follows. Number one, the high prevalence of reported telepathic communication in encounters. Nathan, this is pretty much the default. You rarely ever hear about accounts of someone saying, we just couldn't understand each other because we spoke different languages, or we didn't have the same kind of vocal cord kind of musculature. So that's the first thing. Second, there's correlation between sightings and encounters and altered states of consciousness. So we have people having encounters and sightings, plain as day, when they're just going to work, whatever, or at night, not under the influence of anything. But we have other people that are in altered states of consciousness that seem to readily have these experiences as well. What is the overlap there? And then clustering of experiences around individuals with particular profiles. So in other words, this doesn't happen equally to everyone in the population. There is a disproportionate number of sightings and interactions for people who have, for instance, trauma in childhood and elements of neurodivergence in their personality or their makeup. So these three, they're big ones, Nathan: telepathic communication, correlation with altered states of consciousness, and the profiles particular to experiencers.
All right, so the first one, I think, absolutely confronts the models that we've already talked about, because it starts to stretch you a lot in the sense that, how is this taking place without spoken word? And two, as you said, how is it that I'm hearing in my head the English language from whatever this being is that clearly does not look like it's from my neck of the woods, so to speak. So this first one is directly something that challenges the conventional models, challenges our understanding of what is possible. So it's starting to break your brain, literally. It's kind of cracking it from the inside out, and exposing you to modalities of experience that are not typical. It's a highly atypical way of experiencing the world. And so that single one is kind of I think becomes a thorn, sticking inside of your psyche. How do you make sense of any experience of all these sorts of things? It starts to, it's not something you can neatly push aside and say, well, okay, that maybe they had a fancy new iPhone they were using that allows them to project thoughts into my brain. I think that gets a little bit challenging. So the second one, the correlation between the sightings, encounters, and the altered states of consciousness, That is challenging too, because as you kind of point out there, it's not a uniform situation. It's not that, okay, let's take this mind altering substance and I'm guaranteed to have this experience. Some people have the same experience without having the substance at all. And so you have to sort of then kind of explain why that would be. Why is that possible that they can both have the experiences, one with an altered state in the classical sense and one without? It's really, really difficult, I think, to make sense of that in our physicalist model. So there's something else going on that speaks to how those things can occur. The clustering, the third one, around clustering around the individuals of particular profiles. This is one of those things that's also interesting because it does challenge our modern understanding of the mind. So when you read that one off, my default is going, well, yeah, their brains are broken, and so that's why they're seeing weird stuff, right? They have an atypical physiology, and therefore that is why they're seeing visions and having all these kinds of things. What other explanation could there possibly be? It doesn't. That my default answer to that is that there's something wrong with them physically that creates these situations, and I think that's what most individuals' default reaction would be to someone claiming they've had these encounters. What is physiologically wrong with you? Instead of questioning the model of reality itself and saying maybe something about their physiology exposes them to aspects of reality that are there that I'm limited in seeing, right? So that they're always there, but I'm kind of blinded to their reality because my physiology is constructed in such a way that prevents me from seeing that. So in that latter interpretation, you're not looking down on that individual quite as much as you were in the former, where you think there's something wrong with them. In this latter interpretation, maybe there's something wrong with you. And so that, I think, is an interesting way to look at it. And regardless, it's going to confront your sensibilities, confront your sense of what should work, what should make sense. And the more you wrestle with these three things, I think you're going to have to find, if you're looking for satisfactory answers, you're going to have to find those answers in uncharted territory that you're not familiar with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about a few things here. When it comes to the telepathic communication, just to clarify something that I think actually is still slightly misunderstood even within our community, I don't think it's actually the case that people are hearing English in their head. I think they infer that they're hearing English in their head. Because again, one of the unquestioned assumptions is the only language I know for a lot of people is one language. It's my primary language I learned in childhood. There is no other way of knowing. So if we understand something, then we assume it must have been communicated in our native tongue. But that, again, is inferred. And when people actually press them, and I've seen this happen, and say, so you remember specifically what words? Well, no, it's more like, and then they kind of struggle, and you realize they don't have a conception to make sense of what actually happened to them. Now, of course, from a non-dual perspective, this makes all the sense in the world, because we're all arising from one undivided, undifferentiated field of consciousness, which is pure awareness. It's not just a flat void. It is a highly aware void. It is the undifferentiated field from which everything else arises. And so it makes sense that this would be prior to language, that you can communicate because you are ultimately the same thing, which is fascinating because when we pair that with the messages that many of these beings actually introduce, that's the message, that we're actually the same as you. We're more alike than you realize. So that's something that's so fascinating about telepathy. I also want to point out that something you and I brought up before, we touched on different episodes, is this recent cultural phenomenon around the telepathy tapes. And this has to do with what you talked about in the third point, to do with neurodivergence, right, and different profiles of experiencers, is that these highly autistic, nonverbal kids are incredibly telepathic. And not only that, but they can actually meet up with each other on some sort of virtual hill. Now, of course, people say, that's interesting how they can create virtual hills. And again, the assumption is, but everything that I do here, the hills I go and hike on during the day here, those are real. They're somehow substantively different than the hill these kids meet up on. But again, this data begins to question all of those things. So that's fascinating when it comes to telepathy and the combination with the neurodivergence aspect. Now, in terms of the second element, correlation between sightings, encounters, and altered states, this one is equally fascinating and incredibly troubling for many, many people. Many people do have their brain break around this one. And it's interesting because you talked earlier about how regardless of the experience you've had, you're still going to bring in your interpretive grid to make sense of that experience. And some people who have both had mind-blowing experiences, but assume this is a physicalist reality, right? That this is a physical world. And they desperately want people to affirm to them that this happened in reality, which is to say it was physical. They really resist this notion that some people can have similar experiences by taking psychedelics, for instance. But I've brought up many times on this podcast and on Point of Convergence that my friend Sinead went to Peru, did a shamanic ceremony with a shaman, took ayahuasca, ended up meeting up with aliens on board a UFO that seemed happy that she had met up with them again. And when I brought that up with this particular experiencer and Jeff Kripal, I remember that experiencer saying, yeah, but that's different. And she said it's different because she didn't want to believe it could be the same thing because in her mind, that made it less real. But again, this is the question. What is the nature of reality? Let's not be so quick to apply it to a pre-existing notion when what the data might be demanding we do is question those things. Last one I want to give as an example that I brought up in a recent interview is I remember there's this guy who's an American guy who had moved to Japan, and he had been an abductee as well, he and his son. And he was frustrated that it was kind of a one-way street, that they could abduct him whenever they wanted, but he had no way of communicating with them. But he went and did the Gateway program at the Monroe Institute and found a way to astral travel and found himself on board the craft meeting with these same beings. So there clearly is a convergence here, and really it's only wishful thinking if you pretend there's not. Finally, on the one about the neurodivergence and trauma in childhood, this has been one that I've wrestled with for a long time because it's clear that it's in the data. And like you said, there are some people who immediately go, well, yeah, this makes sense because these people are hallucinating things that are not really there. This makes a lot of sense, actually. And I've seen people literally say that to me. But I don't think it's that. I do think there's a clear correlation and connection with disassociation, but not disassociation as we usually frame it within a physicalist notion of reality. Disassociation would suggest that you can attune your consciousness differently, which opens you up to, exposes you to different levels of reality, and that particular kind of configuration might also be opportune to some of these other intelligences. So I think there is a connection there, but it's not the one people often point to. Last thing I want to say that's really fascinating when we think about this connection between physicality and these different skills that people bring to bear. I was saying to you before we started recording that there's this amazing case of this guy in Western Canada who got jumped when he was coming out of a bar, had a brain injury, woke up being a mathematical savant. And on top of that, he now sees geometric patterns and auras everywhere he goes. He can literally see what looks like this substrate patterning, the fractal patterning that is prior to the painting on of the details in reality, which again comports very much with the experiences I've had. So what we are confronted with there is not someone who has a broken brain, who's hallucinating, but someone who's had things rattled to such a degree that the constraints have lessened to the point where they're seeing more of reality and maybe even seeing aspects of reality that are prior to the final rendering that most people are subject to. So truly, truly fascinating. And some of those same people I would point out can be in downtown Manhattan and can see grays walking around and other people can't see them. So this is truly fascinating, but I think where the implications go is different than people often think. All right, let me give the next three and we'll both dive in here. So the first one is the UFO phenomenon consistently reproduces encounter structures already present in humanity's mytho-religious record, rather than introducing wholly novel forms or intelligences. So in other words, Jacques Vallée has pointed this out a lot in Passport to Magonia and different books like that, where not only are people encountering beings that seem to be not human, but there's remarkable similarity both in their appearances and in their behavior. So that's the first one. The second one is the frequent presence of symbolic, non-literal, or dreamlike encounter content. You've heard me talk about this a lot, Nathan. We've discussed it on a recent Liminal Phrames episode. The symbolic overlay, they're both literal and symbolic. What's the issue with that? And finally, reports of missing time and subjective time distortion, which again speaks to the nature of reality itself. So jump in on those three.
Okay. The first one is really interesting to me, just having been a student of religion, of theology, and observing those parallels that you're talking about, that it is, so there are some different explanations as to why that might be. So the conventional explanation that I think I would have brought to the phenomena in the past would have been to say, humans are myth-making creatures. Like we are primed to use kind of mythical language to explain our experiences. And so there's a reason why these motifs recur in the human history, and that's because they're just imbued, they're embedded in what it's like to be a human being. It's part of who we are, where it's a way for us to make sense of the world. We create these stories to kind of insert ourselves in the story, in the narrative, and myth is much more powerful than kind of dry fact about the way the world works. It's much more interesting if you're going to be a storyteller and you're trying to impart some wisdom onto the next generation, that you're going to come up with a fanciful kind of story and pass it on in that way. So that would have been the way I would have approached this in the past. And I want to caveat that by saying that does happen. Like that is something that we do. It's not like what I'm about to say isn't going to, disregard the fact that is real. But what I find interesting is that there is, in a way, almost like an archetypal encounter with whatever these beings are, with these non-human intelligence. There is seemingly a templated way in which information is exchanged and absorbed, and there can be different explanations for that beyond just that we are myth-making creatures, right? There can be different explanations for that I think we're going to dive into in a little bit, that maybe have a little bit greater explanatory power. I find that this one interesting as well, because a lot of the conclusions of experiencers are often quite similar. And so you can look at stories in our human history and our religious texts. You can read a lot of experiencer accounts where there's a tremendous degree of urgency in conveying what they seemingly have received from these encounters. And you wouldn't go to the lengths that you'd go through to record those experiences if you didn't feel they were super important and other people needed to know about this right away. And so there's a reason why these experiences continue to bubble to the top of our traditions, right? They're imbued with a sense of urgency, and almost there's a compulsion that takes hold of the individual that has the experience. And so, what does that mean? You've had some people in the community interpret this as, aha, this is the trickster aspect of the phenomena. It just likes playing games with us. It likes introducing us to the same kinds of information. It maybe dresses up a little bit different every time, depending on where the person's from, but ultimately it's just going to pull the rug out from under us, and it's going to have a good laugh about it. And that is one explanation, and it's a popular explanation that you hear a lot of leading thinkers in the space tout that as, you can't trust the NHI because this is just what they do. That is one explanation. I don't think that that's the best explanation. I think there's something deeper happening there. And there's a reason why these things continue to sort of resurface. And hopefully we can touch on that a little bit. Now, the second one, the presence of symbolic, non-literal, or dreamlike content. I mean, this one, it's like it has baked into the experience the ability to discount its reality, right? So when you have people that say things like, I encountered this being, And I swear it was in my room, but I also sort of felt like I was in a dream. But I mean, I know I wasn't really asleep. And so if you're listening to an encounter like that, you're kind of thinking to yourself, I mean, I think you just probably were asleep. It's easy to discount the reality of that experience. But what we find with people that have those experiences is they treat them far more importantly than a dream. So their actions which follow the experience are not the normal actions that follow a dream that we might have. And so there's something more profound taking place there than just a dream. But it's enough to, like, again, with that trickster element, it's enough for you to go, I don't know, maybe they're just messing with us. I don't think that's really I don't think that's the appropriate takeaway. I think there's a deeper sort of aspect to reality that is hinted at in the fact that these take on the dreamlike qualities. And then the reports of missing time, subjective time distortion, I think that fits in with number 2, quite well, in the sense that it messes with your ability to apply your linear experience, your narrative making linear experience of what we call the real world, the waking world. It limits your ability to apply that to the experience itself. And so you're left with a very discombobulating, disconcerting, very shaky foundation under which you're making sense of these experiences. And so you're forced to have to experience them not in a linear way that we normally experience our day-to-day life. You're forced to wrestle with the experiences in this symbolic realm, in this very strange dreamlike quality, and I think because of that, we tend to sometimes treat them less seriously. Like if knowledge can't be gained in the way I'm used to gaining knowledge, it must not be as valid. Where I think that might be the opposite take, that if you really look at the way these experiences unfold, the association, the way in which the encounters evoke knowledge in the experiencer is in fact truer to the way knowledge is gained than not. So I think that's something really worth exploring, and all 3 of these very strongly point to another model of reality than the one that we would conventionally bring to those experiences.
Right, and that's the key point, because I think a lot of people initially, again, thinking they have no reason to question physicalism, will come across elements like this in certain reports and just dismiss them, excuse them, don't try to account for them at all. Jacques Vallée, again, to his immense credit, was one of the few people who said, listen, these are parts of these stories. These are parts of the narrative. We can't just exclude them. That's not good science. And because, again, ufologists wanted this to be accepted in the mainstream, which assumed a physicalist substrate to reality, they would also edit out these elements of the story, which, again, I think in the long run does a disservice to our ability to have greater awareness about what's actually going on here. Okay, so let me dive into each of these. So the first one, the common occurrence with figures and aspects that seem reminiscent of mytho-religious history and the record of that. It is truly interesting, and Jacques Vallée, of course, was the first one to point out, along with Jean Keel, that this might be the same thing, that this is not just coincidentally similar, but that actually we may have been mistaking this as a recent phenomenon. We will inevitably have people that come out of that James Fox conference from yesterday assuming that this is a recent technological phenomenon that maybe goes back to 1947, or Grush's references to a crash in the 1930s. We have the airships around the turn of the century, but that's about as far as it goes for a lot of people. But Jacques Vallée and others have pointed out that when you look at the history, you actually pull together historic accounts, there are remarkably similar accounts across history, and they just don't stop. So really, we are overlaying something, some interpretive analysis that doesn't actually exist in the data itself when we assume this is something that's separate from the history. And I recently reread A Daimonic Reality by Patrick Harpur. And it's interesting because he talks about where he grew up in the UK. people talk more about fairies than they do about UFOs and aliens. At least they used to when he was writing that book. And that's because that's just part of their history, that those kind of beings were spotted much more often. And so from his point of view, again, just like Vallée and Keel, when he looked at it, he said, this probably is the same thing, and it probably is telling us something about the nature of reality itself. There also is implied here a relationship between our cultural expectations and the way these things manifest. So again, we have a bridge here. We have people who say it's either real and objective, or people who say it's hallucination and therefore not real, right? Unreal. Well, here we have a notion that reality itself might be this correspondence between expectation and something arising from some deeper semantic field, and that the expectations of the individual inevitably play a role in what ends up manifesting, how it ends up manifesting. I would really want to get people to think deeply about that when we think about the common humanoid forms. We often look to evolutionary history to perhaps explain that. The notion of convergent evolution, again, which still arises within physicalism. But what if it has to do with something more like Platonic kind of forms? And what does that kind of suggest about reality? I also want to point out here that you brought up tricksters, and I'm really glad you did, because this one's pretty fascinating. Because again, there's a lot of after the fact kind of interpretation that we overlay. So we say they did one thing and then they switched something. It was a bait and switch kind of moment. So we assume there's a deceptive quality there, or at least they just like to have fun with us and dupe us kind of thing. But again, that assumes that reality usually unfolds in a certain way. And Bernardo Kastrup has pointed this out, that we assume that logic exists prior to and transcendent to human conception. But what if that's not true? What if logic and the axioms that we assume are at the heart of reality are just what is interjected, what is seeded into a particular constraint paradigm, which is the reality we usually inhabit? But if you're having intersections from intelligences outside of that construct, they need not follow those forms that are seeded into the construct as part of the beginning, the formation of that construct. So again, we're making assumptions about there being one reality that's continuous across full existence. Again, more and more you begin to question, what are we actually existing within? What do we usually experience? And how are these things perhaps intersecting with that rather than arising from within it? The next one was the frequent presence of symbolic, non-literal, or dreamlike encounters. So this one I've talked a lot about, really fascinating. You talked about how there's this element that because of the nature of the experience, they tend to be self-negating, right? And people like Jacques Vallée have also said this, that he has concluded, or at least suggested, that perhaps the phenomenon covers its own tracks deliberately by cloaking it in these elements that will be dismissed by the mainstream. I think that's a fascinating consideration to consider, but I actually think it goes deeper than that. I think it speaks to the fact that, and you pointed to this, we preference a certain kind of experience, a certain mode of consciousness, waking state consciousness, we assume is more real. In a lot of ways, we would say it's the only real measure of reality. And dreams and other kind of hypnagogic experiences and whatnot, people take less seriously. What if it's the opposite way around? And again, we have evidence coming out of neuroscience that's suggesting this now. What if there are fewer constraints around our configuration of consciousness in the hypnagogic state, under the influence of psychedelics, when we're deep in meditation and we put the default mode to sleep? We might be experiencing more of reality. I would suggest to you we are, and that's why they show up here. And they show up in a dreamlike way because this is prior to and transcendent to the usual crystallization within the usual mode of consciousness. But that's just one mode. And if they're coming from beyond and intersecting with our usual mode of consciousness, they need not congeal into these particular forms. There may not be object permanence to these kinds of structures and even these kinds of beings. I said this recently in discussing the lady and figures like her historically. So this one I think is truly fascinating, and rather than it being an inconvenience, I think it's telling us something really, really important about the nature of reality itself. I'll just quickly touch on reports of missing time and subjective time distortion. really that just hints at a much deeper reality because, as I said to you before we started recording, I know experiencers who literally were on board a craft, had Grays show them something about their life, and then that came into being 8, 10, 15 years later. So again, it calls into question, what is reality? What is time? What is free will? I would suggest that we do have free will, but it's not located. The agency isn't where we think it is. This goes to the fact that we hear reports of, again, empirical results, and I brought this up in the Techniques of Transcendence class in session 1. We have empirical results showing us that our bodies are showing signs of knowing a decision has been made several seconds before we think we've made the decision in our mind. So we are hallucinating not the fact that we have agency, but where the agency is. I would suggest to you it's arising in our awareness. It's registering at the moment. And we register it the only way we can. We think we're making a decision, but actually it's passing through from a deeper mode of reality. And I would say that we in our ultimate identity are distributed across these different levels of reality, if you will. And again, these different contact modalities speak to the fact that we can change the nature of those constraints and therefore change our configuration of consciousness and our interaction with this deeper reality. So we're getting towards the end here. Let me get some final thoughts from you on what we've discussed today, how fascinating it is, how discombobulating it is. I think we've said that 3 or 4 times now, that word. That's a true liminal frame sign. Tell me where you stand now in all this and what you look forward to in the future.
Yeah, and in my kind of closing reflections, I think what comes up to mind is this notion of foolishness. I think where I struggle, as I suspect many do, with aspects of the phenomena that we've talked about, is the confrontation that it forces on you between the world you think you know and the world that is, sort of coming across your desk. And for you to say, okay, I'm gonna give this attention, I'm gonna give this some serious consideration, you are directly wrestling with this concept of becoming the fool. And so, no one likes to be made a fool. No one likes to be the butt of the joke. And I think that's where you see so many people struggle with this subject. And you see the experiencers struggle with it arguably the most. They've had much more evidence laid on their laps than any of us that there is something to this. And they are the ones who are often the most reticent to speak of those experiences because of that stigma of feeling set apart, of feeling like you don't belong in the world. And you think about the ways in which we as a society kind of force a mean on every person, right? We force a behavioral mean on the way in which we act. And that mean is sometimes not explicitly known. Like we don't have to necessarily spell it out, but we'll know it when we see it, right? Oh, this person is acting a little bit off. They don't seem to fit the mean. And that makes me uncomfortable when I see it. Is there something wrong with them that they're not, so you can see where all this is going. And the phenomena confronts us with, I think, that assumption that that's right to do. The assumption that it's the right thing to do as a society to impose that kind of mean making on reality. Because in doing that, just like we talk about putting the blinders on in our perceptions, we're putting the blinders on our experiences. So we're telling all of us who are participating in that culture, we're saying, this is what's normative. Stay in this lane. If you don't stay in this lane, we're going to have a problem. And so it's very uncomfortable. You can feel it somatically when you're wrestling with this content. If I'm going to come forward and I'm going to say I'm interested in this, I'm going to feel uncomfortable, and I'm going to be outside and I'm going to be exposed and people are going to laugh and think I'm crazy. And I think the reality is that by being a little bit more brave, and here I'm going to speak, even to myself, by being braver with our ability, with our willingness to confront this material, we are acknowledging a part of our lived experience that everyone actually has. And that is, there is no mean, there is no standard experience. Everyone's experience is beautiful. And to say you must express yourself within this band, I think it's so limiting on the human spirit and capacity. And so the phenomena has this beautiful ability to rip that wide open and to, I think, allow us to have more freedom in expressing the true nature of what it means to be alive and explore all of the contours and all the ramifications of what being alive, what having experience entails. And yeah, it's weird and strange and it's creepy and stuff that you just talked about, the higher self and, that's kind of working through you in ways that you're not only conscious of after the fact. These are concepts that are, they do sound crazy. They're not normative, right? But I think they're important to explore. And we have many, many, many touch points in our human story that speak to the validity of that way of looking at the world, and entire cultures who have come and gone, who have lived with that as their truth. And so that's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine. And we shouldn't be as afraid to go there. And I hope that more of us are willing to take that chance. So that's my closing thought on this. It's been really, really interesting to explore. And I find that I may never get to a place where I'm 100% comfortable with this material. And maybe that's part of the point. You should always be a little bit uncomfortable with the kinds of things you're willing to entertain.
Here, and I would go one step further and say that the entire point of the exercise is that we not settle on a particular perspective. And in fact, I would suggest that the intersections that are happening in our perceived reality from this meta-intelligence are designed for two things. To, number one, open up new possibility space by constantly interjecting elements that might appear as highly strange that will make us go in new directions. But simultaneously, it can't be so common and commonplace that it collapses the coherence of the general perspective. So you're always trying to find that balance. It's a dance that is taking place. And I think that's been happening throughout our history and will continue to. And I think this speaks to the control system that Vallée, again, we've mentioned him a lot. He brought this up, but I see it as a positive thing ultimately. But fundamentally, this is the part that's really challenging for people. We are no different than that control system. That control system is us at another level. Just like we talked about, we sometimes have things operating on us at an unconscious or a subconscious or a pre-conscious level, and we can empirically show it's the case. And that's the final point I'll make, is that when you talk about that stigma, a couple things about that. Number one, because that stigma is so strong, there are many experiencers would rather find that they're crazy. They were seeking a diagnosis. They weren't saying, I hope it's aliens and I'm not crazy. They would say, I hope I'm crazy because I sure don't want to believe it's aliens. That shows you how strong that stigma is, even at a level that we're not even fully registering. But that also is a myth. That is a modern myth. That's something we've talked a lot about. People will wax philosophic about previous centuries when people felt all this religious pressure to adhere to a certain model of reality under a monotheistic kind of tradition. But in the physicalist tradition, how much pressure do people feel to adhere to that? And what kind of civilization has resulted? What has physicalism produced? Many positive things in the modern world, but we have felt more disassociated from each other, more disenchanted perhaps than ever. And I would suggest to everyone that what this phenomenon does is calls that into question and allows us to, again, unite with some of our ancestors who saw it differently. And to me, that leads to a more enchanting future.
Absolutely. Well, it's that time again. We've enjoyed having you come along with us on this journey. We'll leave you with this. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.